You don't remember the first time you saw them, not because the films were forgettable, but because your eyes were never meant to stop there. Some horror movies don't scare you with what they show. They disturb you with what they allow to pass unnoticed, details buried in shadow shapes, drifting at the edge of the frame, images that register only subconsciously before your attention is pulled away. At the time of their release, no one questioned them. Nothing was flagged. Nothing was removed. The audience walked out thinking they had seen the whole film. Years later, watching again, often alone, often at night, something feels wrong. A figure where there shouldn't be one. A composition that suddenly makes sense for the wrong reasons. A background moment that now feels deliberate, almost confrontational. These are not lost films. They were released, reviewed, archived, and rewatched. Yet they carried fragments that slipped through cultural awareness unnoticed. Whether placed there intentionally or allowed to remain through indifference, they existed in plain sight, hiding behind pacing lighting and the audience's own expectations of where horror is supposed to live. Because horror doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently in the corner of the frame, confident that most people will never look back. Tonight, we're not counting the scariest scenes. We're examining the moments you weren't supposed to focus on, the images that only become disturbing after you realize they were always there. And once you notice them, the question isn't why they were hidden, it's why no one saw them sooner. 1. The Ninth Configuration, 1980. This film disguises itself as something manageable, part psychological drama, part philosophical debate. It invites interpretation, even humor. What it does not invite is suspicion. Throughout the film, visual cues quietly undermine the surface tone. Characters are framed in groupings that feel symbolically weighted. Background details recur without explanation. Spaces feel staged rather than lived in, as if the environment itself is participating in the conversation. On first viewing, these elements pass unnoticed. The dialogue demands attention. The performances command focus. The eye follows the intellect of the film, not its physical construction. Only later does the imbalance become clear. The film consistently places meaning outside the spoken word. It allows the frame to contradict the dialogue, to suggest order where chaos is claimed or chaos where certainty is asserted. The unsettling thought emerges slowly. What if the film wasn't asking you to solve its questions, but to notice where it stopped explaining itself? 2. The Beyond, 1981. This film has always been associated with dream logic images that refuse explanation, scenes that bleed into one another without warning. On a first viewing, the experience feels overwhelming, almost incoherent. But look closer, and the frame tells a different story. Certain visual elements recur with unsettling consistency. Backgrounds align in ways that suggest spatial rules. The narrative refuses to explain. Doorways, thresholds, and empty rooms are framed repeatedly, as if the film is teaching the viewer where danger actually resides. At the time, critics dismissed these choices as excess or indulgence, style over substance. But revisiting the film reveals a strange discipline. The chaos is selective. Some images return too often, too deliberately to be meaningless. The film doesn't want to confuse you completely. It wants to confuse you just enough that you stop asking why certain things remain in view. And once you realize how much of the horror exists in what the film refuses to clarify, the boundaries between scene and suggestion dissolve entirely. 3. Possession, 1981. This film is remembered for its emotional extremity, performances pushed to their limits, scenes that feel uncomfortably exposed. What often goes unnoticed is how controlled its visual language remains beneath that apparent chaos. The camera moves with a purpose that isn't immediately obvious. Characters are framed against negative space that feels intentional rather than incidental. Backgrounds seem to close in, not through motion, but through alignment walls, corridors, and architectural lines converging in ways that subtly disorient the eye. When audiences first encountered the film, the intensity of the performances dominated attention. The eye clung to faces, to movement, to emotional eruption. Meanwhile, the frame quietly reinforced a different narrative, one about division, doubling, and collapse. Rewatching reveals that very little in the background is neutral. Positions repeat. Angles mirror each other. What felt raw and uncontrolled is revealed as carefully composed. The disturbing realization arrives late. The film never loses control. It only pretends to, knowing the viewer will look away at the exact moments composition matters most. 4. The Changeling, 1980. This is a film built on restraint. Its horror relies on space, silence, and patience. But beneath that calm surface lies a visual discipline that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The camera consistently favors stillness. Objects remain centered long after their narrative purpose has passed. Background spaces are framed with a clarity that feels intentional, almost accusatory. The film doesn't rush you. It gives you time to look whether you choose to or not. When it was released, these choices were praised as elegance, craftsmanship, a return to classical ghost storytelling. Few questioned why the film seemed so invested in showing what wasn't happening. Revisiting it now reveals a quieter tension. The film conditions the viewer to expect meaning from absence. To trust that if the camera lingers, something matters, even if it hasn't revealed itself yet. And once that expectation is established, the horror no longer needs to appear. The frame itself becomes the threat. 5. The Brood, 1979. This film is often discussed in terms of its themes: anger, repression, emotional inheritance. What's less acknowledged is how visually literal those ideas become, long before the audience understands why. Throughout the film, background spaces echo the emotional state of the characters with unsettling precision. Corridors narrow. Rooms feel overstructured. Figures appear positioned not for realism, but for symbolic weight. On a first viewing, these choices feel expressive, even theatrical. At the time, audiences were focused on the confrontational premise and its implications. The eye followed the narrative conflict. The visual subtext remained quietly embedded, functioning beneath conscious interpretation. Seen again, those compositions feel almost instructional. The film isn't waiting for its ideas to be revealed. It's placing them in the frame repeatedly, trusting that the viewer's mind will absorb them before the story catches up. The unsettling realization is simple. By the time the film explains itself, it has already shown you everything. 6. The Evil, 1978. This film was largely dismissed on release, uneven, confused, excessive. Few took the time to look closely at how it was constructed. And that neglect may be exactly why certain details went unexamined. The camera often drifts without clear motivation, landing on spaces that feel unrelated to the immediate action. Mirrors reflect angles the scene doesn't acknowledge. Background figures appear briefly framed too precisely to feel accidental, yet never referenced again. On first viewing, these moments feel like mistakes, technical sloppiness rather than intent. But rewatching complicates that assumption. The same types of visual intrusions repeat. The same framing logic returns. What looked like carelessness begins to resemble a pattern, one that relies on the audience dismissing it as incompetence. The film never asks for your trust. It assumes your indifference. And once you realize how often the frame contains more information than the story admits, a different discomfort emerges. What if the chaos wasn't hiding meaning, but protecting it? 7. Alucarda, 1977. Unlike the films before it, this one does not hide behind restraint. Its imagery is excessive, confrontational, and openly transgressive. And yet some of its most unsettling details still manage to slip past unnoticed. The chaos becomes camouflage. Amid the hysteria, the film embeds recurring visual motifs, placements of bodies, symbols, and gestures that repeat with ritualistic precision. On a first viewing, the intensity overwhelms analysis. The viewer reacts instead of observes. At the time, critics dismissed the film as indulgent, even sloppy. Too much, too loud, too uncontrolled. But revisiting it reveals an unexpected discipline beneath the excess. Certain images return too consistently to be accidental, framed too deliberately to be random. The realization arrives slowly. The film isn't losing control. It's using excess to ensure that control remains invisible. And once that possibility settles in, the line between chaos and design becomes disturbingly thin. 8. Full Circle: The Haunting of Julia, 1977. This film moves quietly, almost cautiously, built around grief and psychological isolation rather than spectacle. Its horror unfolds in absences, rooms that feel unfinished, silences that stretch just a moment too long. What's easy to miss is how often the film places meaning just outside the emotional center of the frame. Windows reflect movement that doesn't belong to the scene. Background rooms remain visible but unentered. The camera holds on architectural details as if waiting for something to happen, yet nothing ever does. When the film was first seen, these moments were interpreted as restraint, tasteful minimalism, a refusal to indulge in cheap scares. But viewed now, they feel more deliberate. The film repeatedly invites the viewer to search the frame only to deny confirmation. The result is a subtle conditioning. The audience learns to scan, to doubt, to anticipate, without ever being rewarded with certainty. The fear isn't created by what appears, but by what almost does. And once that pattern becomes clear, the film feels less like a ghost story and more like an exercise in 9. The Sentinel, 1977. For most viewers, this film is remembered for its religious imagery and shocking finale. What tends to be forgotten is how deliberately the film prepares the eye long before that moment arrives. Throughout the runtime, the camera repeatedly frames secondary characters in ways that feel oddly static. Faces linger in the background without narrative justification. Crowd scenes are composed with unnatural stillness, as if certain figures are meant to be observed rather than passed through. On first viewing, these details register as atmosphere, uncomfortable but indistinct. At the time of release, audiences were focused on the overt shock of the story's implications. Few questioned why so many background figures appeared disconnected from the action, or why the camera seemed reluctant to abandon them. The film never tells you to look closer. It simply refuses to look away itself. Revisiting the film reframes those choices entirely. What once felt like incidental casting now feels intentional. The background is no longer passive. It is watching, waiting, and silently defining the space. The unsettling thought comes late. What if the film wasn't hiding its truth, but slowly teaching the audience how to accept it? 10. Burnt Offerings, 1976. This film is remembered for its slow burn and suffocating atmosphere, a house that seems to watch its occupants more than shelter them. What's less discussed is how consistently the camera aligns the viewer with the house itself. Throughout the film, compositions favor empty spaces. Staircases, windows, hallways, areas that hold no immediate action are framed with quiet insistence. Characters move through these spaces, but the camera often arrives before them or lingers after they leave. At the time, this was seen as mood building, a stylistic way to stretch tension. But in hindsight, the repetition becomes harder to ignore. The film trains the viewer to accept emptiness as neutral, even comforting, until it isn't. When revisited, it becomes clear that the most unsettling presence in the film isn't announced. It's introduced gradually, visually, through spaces the audience was conditioned to overlook. By the time the realization arrives, the damage is already done. You've spent the entire film sharing a point of view that was never human to begin with. 11. The Medusa Touch, 1978. This is not a horror film that hides its intentions. It deals openly with influence control and the destructive power of thought. And yet, its most unsettling moments exist far from its central premise. The film repeatedly frames characters against reflective surfaces, architectural symmetry, and distant observers who are never acknowledged. The background often mirrors the emotional state of the scene, but in ways so subtle they escape notice until patterns begin to repeat. At the time, these choices were read as elegant direction, tasteful restraint, nothing more. But rewatching reveals a visual language that feels deliberately suggestive, as if the film is quietly reinforcing its themes, not through dialogue, but through placement. The camera doesn't accuse, it implies. It allows the viewer to assemble meaning only after the fact, when the story has already taken root. And once you notice how often the film positions power at the edges of the frame, The question shifts from fiction to form. Is the film merely about influence, or is it practicing it? 12. The Devil's Reign, 1975. On the surface, this film leans into spectacle rituals. Chants, faces frozen in ecstatic horror. Audiences at the time focused on what was loud and unmistakable. The danger seemed obvious, almost theatrical. But the elements that linger longest aren't the ones demanding attention. Look past the rituals and the frame begins to behave strangely. Background figures hold positions too precisely. Camera angles linger on faces that are not reacting, not participating, merely present. In several sequences, the composition places the most visually complex information away from the action, allowing it to register without explanation. When it was first released, these choices were dismissed as excess stylized chaos meant to overwhelm. But viewed carefully now, the chaos feels organized. The eye is led through movement and sound, while the background remains curiously controlled, almost ritualistic in itself. It begins to feel less like a film documenting a cult, and more like a film operating like one, relying on distraction, repetition, and sensory overload to ensure certain images pass unexamined. The unsettling realization isn't what the film shows. It's how confidently it assumes you won't question where you're looking. 13. The Mephisto Waltz, 1971. This film openly engages with dark rituals and forbidden knowledge, yet its most disturbing elements are not the ones placed front and center. They reside in the margins, in glances that linger too long, in arrangements that feel symbolically precise without explanation. Background figures occasionally align in ways that feel intentional, forming visual echoes that go unnoticed on a first viewing. Certain compositions frame characters against objects or symbols that are never addressed by the narrative, yet repeat often enough to suggest design rather than coincidence. When it was released, audiences were distracted by the overt themes, the cult elements, the performances, the obvious menace. The eye was given plenty to process. And while it processed, that something else slipped through unchallenged. Watching it now, the film feels less like it's showing occult practices and more like it's embedding them quietly, visually, and without commentary. Not to be discovered immediately, but to be recognized later once the viewer is no longer being guided. Which raises an uncomfortable thought. Were these details meant to be hidden, or were they simply placed where most people wouldn't think to look? 14. The Night Visitor, 1971. This is a film obsessed with intrusion. Someone arriving where they don't belong, moving through spaces that should be secure. But its most unsettling intrusions don't occur within the story. They occur within the frame itself. The camera frequently adopts a distant observational posture. Hallways stretch longer than necessary. Windows remain visible long after their narrative purpose has passed. The film's lighting creates zones of visibility that feel deliberately uneven, leaving peripheral areas dim but readable if the viewer chooses to read them. Originally, these choices were interpreted as mood, atmosphere, style. But when revisited, a different pattern emerges. The background often carries more tension than the foreground. The eye is repeatedly pulled toward places the story claims are empty. Nothing jumps out. Nothing is emphasized. And that's precisely the point. The film doesn't hide its unease behind shock. It distributes it across the frame, trusting that most viewers will stay focused on the obvious threat. Only later does it become clear that the film was asking a quieter question all along. Who is really watching whom? 15. The Shuttered Room, 1967. At first glance, this film presents itself as a restrained Gothic mystery. Isolated landscapes, emotional repression, a sense of something old and unresolved. Nothing about its reputation suggests danger. Yet when revisited carefully, the unease doesn't come from the narrative, but from what quietly occupies the frame behind it. Certain interior shots linger just long enough for the eye to register depth, but not long enough to explore it. Doorways appear slightly too dark. Background spaces feel occupied without ever confirming why. In several scenes, the camera holds steady, while characters move forward, leaving the rear of the frame untouched, unchallenged, almost daring the viewer to look away. At the time of release, These moments blended into the film's somber tone. Audiences were guided toward the drama, toward dialogue, toward the emotional surface. The eye followed instruction. The background remained unquestioned, seen now that restraint feels calculated. The composition doesn't scream for attention, it waits. And once noticed, the silence behind those shuttered spaces becomes louder than anything the characters say. The question is not what's hidden there. It's whether the film trusted the audience not to look. Bonus fact: there are films that become disturbing not because they change, but because we do. This one was once considered quiet, even unremarkable. Its images passed without comment, its framing accepted as natural, its silences interpreted as restraint. Nothing about it demanded scrutiny. Nothing appeared dangerous enough to question. Years later, watching it again, the discomfort doesn't come from shock or revelation. It comes from recognition. Certain images now feel misplaced. Certain compositions linger longer than they should. Background moments once dismissed as empty begin to carry weight, not because the film has revealed something new, but because the viewer has learned how to look differently. What was once invisible is no longer hidden. The unsettling truth is not that the film concealed something forbidden. It's that it trusted time to do the revealing. And time always does. These films were never locked away. They weren't censored, destroyed, or erased. They were simply allowed to exist, confident that most people would watch them the way they were told to watch them. But once you notice how often meaning lives at the edge of the frame, how often discomfort waits just outside the obvious moment, it becomes harder to trust what you think you've already seen. So here's the question to leave you with. If an image was always there, clear, visible, and unchallenged, was it ever truly hidden at all? Or were we just never meant to notice it?